Hey everyone. So welcome back to the people that have come back, and hello to everybody who's joining. I'm Memo and this is my channel, Houseplanty Goodness. So I've hinted at this for a couple of my other videos and on my Instagram profile, but I've been promising people for a long time that I would actually talk about how I make my Airy Aroid soil mix. And I say soil mix, this actually doesn't have any actual soil in it, so it's essentially a growing media, but for the intents and purposes of this video, we'll call it a soil mix. As I've mentioned on my previous videos, as a new YouTube creator, it does really help if you like this. Drop a like down below. If you want to see more content like this from myself, please do subscribe. I will be trying to upload 2 to 3 times a week. So yeah, let's get into this. So one of the first ingredients essentially within this mix that you will see is, and apologies again for the really horrendous plastic takeaway containers, but you know what, I'm reusing this plastic, and this is usually how I would measure things out in order to make my soil mix so they're getting good use. So one of the first things that I use, and probably the biggest component of the soil mix, is actually cocoa coir. And cocoa coir is shredded coconut husk. And you can get all of this ingredients. I got all of these things from Amazon. You can find this on Amazon quite easily. I'll see if I can drop a link down below to all the ingredients that I specifically buy from Amazon if you want to see that. But essentially, this is shredded coconut husk. And I know some people are in big cities where they don't necessarily have space to be buying bags and bags of this, which can be quite cumbersome. But this actually comes in either a bag, which is loose, or a compacted brick form where you would just put a litre or 2 of water in this and it would expand into what you're seeing here. The one thing I would advise is that a lot of the cocoa coir that's being produced is actually being produced near coastal regions of the Far East in India, if I'm not mistaken, and sometimes it's washed out with seawater, so it could have a relatively high level of salt in it, which is not great for your plants. So definitely check that out when you're looking to buy the cocoa coir online, if you can find this information. If not, see if you can actually ask the sellers and they might be able to provide some information. So cocoa coir, it's the first thing. It's going to be essentially the main part of the media. It's really good at creating a bit of an airy environment as well. Sometimes you'll see plants that you buy from plant stores or garden centers are exclusively rooted up in just this, but we like to be extra, so let's see what else I usually use within it. The other thing, you might have seen this before, and for my sins, I was an 80s child. Everybody who was around in the 80s will remember this quite a bit within houseplant soil mixers back then. This is perlite. Everybody used to assume that it was polystyrene balls, but actually it's expanded volcanic rock, so it's popped rocks essentially. It's a bit like popcorn. So you can see there, and I don't know if you've noticed the dust that is coming off this. I don't know if that's being picked up by the camera, but that's one thing you need to be aware of when you're using perlite. There is quite a lot of dust within perlite, so it's usually a good idea to either move your head away when you're kind of pouring this out, or potentially, as we're in a pandemic at the moment, most people should have a mask, so maybe wear a mask whilst you're doing this, because you don't really want that dust going into your lungs. I'm pretty sure it's not good for you. But essentially the reason why you would add perlite is to create that airiness in the soil, which would mean that there's pockets of air that the roots can kind of enjoy, and also it creates a much looser soil mix as well, which replicates, and you'll hear me say this again, it replicates what these plants are used to when they're growing in the rainforest, because a lot of the house plants that you get these days are from tropical rainforests, so the soil isn't as dense as you'd find anywhere else, because it will have things like leaf litter, it will be sticks, twigs, all of these things within there, so you want to be replicating that, so making it airy is highly important. Now, as I mentioned before, people who live in the big cities might not want to have large bags of each one of these ingredients, so if you can only afford to get 2 things, I would say buy some cocoa coir and buy a bag of perlite, or buy some soil if you just want to use houseplant soil and perlite as well. And at that point, the mix that you would be doing is a 50-50 straight mix essentially. So 50% cocoa coir or soil and then 50% perlite. And again, that will give it that aeration. And a lot of people swear by just mixing those two. As I said, I'm a bit extra, so I kind of like adding a few other things in there, and I think my plants have liked it so far. So the other thing that I use quite a bit, this is orchid bark, and again, you can buy bags of this on Amazon at garden centers. This one, for some reason, this specific brand came with this thing that they called Ceramis, but I think it's just broken up clay bits essentially. But you can imagine this is a larger version of what the perlite is doing. Essentially, it's creating that chunkiness in the soil and that aeration within the soil. You don't have to use all these extra other amendments, which I'll talk about in a minute. For a long period of time, I was just using equal measures of these three, so a third of each within my soil mix for a lot of my houseplants, and they did really, really well. Essentially, it still creates that airy, chunky mix. But if you want to go the extra mile, and you've got something like, say, for instance, an anthurium, or maybe even something like an alocasia, which wants to have a bit more moisture retention, you can use this, which essentially this is dried up sphagnum moss. Be careful on how you use this, and you can get big bags of this, but I'm not entirely sure. I don't think this is fully renewable, or it's not as renewable as it could be at the moment. So people use this a lot for propagations, and sometimes these are like the extra bits that usually left over when I'm propagating. So I will put this within the soil mix, and it does create some of that airiness as well, but it helps with that moisture retention. And things like anthuriums and alocasias that like to still have an airy soil mix but want to retain some of that moisture will really appreciate some bits of this in the soil itself. The other thing as well that I find works really well, and this was through some research that I was doing online, is horticultural charcoal. And you can see here, this is also mixed up with perlite. So usually I'll reduce the perlite amount ever so slightly when I'm using this, and this will sweeten up the soil essentially. And it is something that really does help to keep that soil fresh. And again, it also still is chunky. You can imagine it will still help with that aeration within the soil. The other thing, and arguably this is really expensive, as you'll understand now by one of its common names, this is black gold, as it's called. This is worm castings, or otherwise it's worm poop. And this is very high in nutrients, so you would throw a small amount of this. I probably wouldn't even use all of this for this. I'd probably only use about half of this. It's very dense in nutrients, as you would imagine it would be, and it also works a bit, if you consider it to be a bit like a slow release fertilizer within the soil, just to kind of help the roots get going and essentially be able to take up some minerals as well, because cocoa coir doesn't have realistically that much minerals or microbes in it, and there is a tiny bit of minerals within the perlite, but not an awful lot, so you get it from that. If you want to use something like that, but maybe you don't want to use that, you can get slow release fertilizer, which is really small, kind of colourful pellets essentially, and you just need to refresh that every 6 months within the soil, either when you're repotting, if you need to repot every year, or potentially you can also top dress, just add a few of those beads or balls essentially on the top of the soil, and it will pull through as you water the plant in the next coming months. The last thing, and arguably the smallest amount of all of it, this is mycorrhizal fungi, and essentially it's dried up fungi, where there's a lot of debate whether or not this is actually working, or whether or not it works for houseplants. But I've got a large bag a few months ago, I've been using it, I've not really had any problems, and I need to get rid of the bag. So essentially what this does, this is fungi that live naturally in the soil, and they will attach to roots of plants, and they have a bit of a symbiotic relationship, so they will help the plant gain some of the moisture and the nutrients from the soil. The plant in itself, some of the nutrients that it's not using, will go into the fungi as well. So essentially what it does, or the theory behind it, is that it helps with moisture absorption, but it also helps the plants survive a bit better, ever so for a bit longer, essentially when they've missed waterings for a few times, so they won't dry out quite as quickly, because it essentially attaches to the root and makes the root system even larger essentially at that point. So yeah, that is everything. As I mentioned, you really don't need to be buying all of this if you've got a serious collection or it's becoming a bit of a proper hobby for you, you might want to start looking at adding some of these things in your soil. If not, you can go for just these 2 or these 3 and you're fine. The last thing I wanted to talk about, and apologies, I should have potentially maybe cleaned this, you can get little trowels to kind of help mix this all up and then put it into the pots, but actually these things, which I don't know what you would call this came as part of a set on Amazon, and it was, I think, a succulent set which had little rakes and all these things, but essentially this has been a godsend. It's like a bucket trowel essentially, or something like that. If you search for something, you will eventually find it on Amazon, but this is exceptionally useful when it comes to mixing the soil up and also putting it into the pots. So yeah, I hope you found that useful. I'm not going to mix it right now because I need to do a much larger batch. I've got quite a few plants that I want to be repotting, and I know some of you might be screaming at your screens right now going, oh, we're coming into winter, at least here in the UK and the EU. You shouldn't really be repotting. I don't always buy into that because I've got a lot of plants that still grow quite a bit even during the winter months, and if I see that they are really struggling and they're busting out of their pots, I do need to repot. So because I've got so many plants, I have actually got quite a few plants that need a bit of repotting now. I will try to avoid it before spring, but I also won't let a plant suffer in a pot that's really got it root bound. Obviously there are exceptions to this, such as the Hoya. The Hoya plants generally don't mind being a bit root bound within their containers. So yeah, hopefully you found this useful. If you've got any questions or comments, drop them down below and let's have that conversation. And yeah, in the meantime, I hope you have a great rest of your day and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks. Bye.